I kind of jumped on the offer to talk to you is because one of the things I've realized over the last few years, and I've done a couple of tours in Europe, speaking mainly to black people in Europe, in Germany and in Austria, in France, and Italy, and I realized that many of us, your generation, you're not really in touch with your radical history, your radical tradition. And so one of the things that we see happening is that you're reinventing failure. Many of the struggles that you are up against right now, we've already won those battles. And because we really don't have a connection, a continuity between the radical histories and the revolutionary movements that have preceded you, you're forced to go it alone in many ways under circumstances that are completely different than when I grew up.
Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, shift your surface with vernacular skill. The raw is near, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies. The critics, all the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic. In anything my enemies still be dead actions. I proceed just life I lead. Beneath it so many seas to win. It's our time to align stars. So spirits lead. Who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly. Given no choice by God's law. I'm Lucifer on streets.
Peace and power. Once again, this is the Panther 48. I'm Brother Psyche, 1/3 of the Panther 48, calling out of Texas. We have Brother E calling out of Florida.
Greetings, people, greetings.
We have Brother Robert Ward Williams, the chairman of the San Diego chapter of the Black Panther Party, and chief of staff of the People's Black Panther Party, headquartered out of Atlanta. He's calling out of California.
All power to the people.
And we have a very special guest in an original Panther, Brother Dhoruba. Brother Dhoruba, matter of fact, I don't think I do the justice introducing you. We're gonna allow you to introduce yourself.
I can't do that, brother. I'm just here, man. You know.
all right. Ain't nothing wrong with that. Brother Ward is gonna handle most of the question and answer, so I'm gonna pass the mic to you, Brother Ward.
All right, well, Brother Dhoruba, the first thing I did want to do was to get into you telling us a little bit about your history in terms of how you got involved with the Black Panther Party, and basically your background upbringing as it applies to what attracted you to the Black Panther Party. So that's kind of the first question I wanted to get you to speak on.
Well, I don't want to, there's an old saying when I was growing up, the self-praise brings no recommendations. So it's kind of hard for me, basically, it's, but I grew up in New York. I grew up in the South Bronx, in Harlem, and I grew up in the 50s, and right after the war, right after the Second World War. When my generation says the war, that's the war they're talking about. Right after the Second World War. And for those of you who might be a little weak on the history tip, it was the Second World War and its aftermath that has formed the world system and order that you grew up in and come to know. And that period of time established institutions and systems and nation states that have developed into the paradigms of geopolitics that we have today. But for me personally, I grew up at the height of the Cold War. And that was a unique period of time for African people in the diaspora, especially in the United States. That was the time of Malcolm X, of course. It was the post-Garvey movement from the early part of the 20th century and after the First World War. My family came from the South on my father's side, and from the West Indies on my mother's side. And so I grew up at a time when the Black community was called a neighborhood, and neighbor wasn't disconnected from the word hood like you all have it today. Neighbor meant neighbor. I grew up in a community where Black folks and Black people looked out for each other and took care of us even when we were on the streets, you know, and unlike what you have today. And I grew up at a time when the Cold War has affected Black people to the point where, you know, we were still in that period of time when de facto segregation in the North was in full swing, and the civil rights movement, so-called civil rights movement, fighting de jure segregation in the South had just begun. I was born in 1944. So by the time of the Supreme Court decision in 1954, I was already 10 years old. So I grew up when Black people could actually sing, you know, when there was, you know, Chicago blues and R&B and doo-wop in New York, when urbanization had and the post-war era had just began to formulate the type of communities and the type of political leaders that you now know from history. You know, Kwame Ture grew up on the other side of the Bronx from me, on Longwood Avenue. So that growing up that way, growing up in the South Bronx, you know, made me someone who understood, or at least I've come to understand exactly who our enemies were and who we were. You know, I grew up hating pigs. I used to bang with them every day. Those pieces of shit in blue uniforms and costumes. And so, you know, they're the ones that molded my hatred for bullies and people who lorded over and oppress people who are weak, who are strong, who are weak, and who have no power. So I've always had an affinity for the grassroots, for my people on that level. I went through the phase, same phase everybody went through in the urban communities at that time. I was a prominent member of the biggest gang in New York, Sportsmen, the Young Disciples, Sportsmen. In fact, Afeni Shakur, you know, she was a little nappy head dead in that formation that we had back in the Bronx, and you know, from '56 to 1960. So that's my experience. My experience was the Black experience in America during the Cold War. That's how I grew up. When I was in elementary school, they used to have air raid drills where we had to get under the desk because the Russians was coming. You see, so white supremacy in the hood, in the Black communities, was not as present or heavy-handed as it is today. We had a misleadership class then, that's just like we have a misleadership class now. But the misleadership class then was totally, was mainly with the faith-based community. And the nationalist community in New York, you know, we had the Nation of Islam, of course, was in the community. Malcolm. But Malcolm came to prominence when I did my first bid in jail, in prison. I went to prison right after I had gotten sacked from the military. You know, I had a little problem with a drill instructor in the U.S. military. You know, see, where I came from, you didn't talk about people's mama. You know, if you see what I'm saying. And this cracker, he wasn't a cracker actually. He was a Chicano. He was a drill sergeant, and they would get all up in your face, spitting all in your face, and tell you, you know, that you a piece of shit, you know, and all that. You know how boot camp goes, you know.
Oh yeah, I definitely.
So, you know, I'm with that until he started talking about my mama, and then we had a problem. So I had to go, you know, I had to bounce. So I wound up in the stockade right during the first Berlin crisis. You know, and they were emptying out the stockades to take inmates, put them in TONE outfits, and send them straight to Berlin. You know, because they were doing it was the whole Berlin crisis. So I think it was 1961. But I wasn't having that, you know. So I got out of that. But but you know, I learned a few things in there. But one of the things I learned was really how to shoot, and so that, you know, that always stood me in good, you know, that experience. But my politics, you know, really developed in prison. You know, and that was at the same time that Malcolm had risen to the stature of a national spokesperson for the nation. My first bid when I went to prison was 1961 or 62. And I did 5 years, and I came out in 1967. And during that period of time is when I really read a lot about history. I had a really good history teacher when I was in elementary school, junior high school. He was a Black teacher, and he made history fascinating to me. So I've always been a student of history, and I'm quite sure you all are aware of what Malcolm says about history being the best subject to reward all research. And so I was a history student, and I read Das Kapital when I was 18, 19 years old. I actually read it. that sounds crazy. I actually read it, and you know, the print was just small. The print was so small, and it was this thick, you know. But I read it, and so it put into perspective a lot for me, especially about my communities. I began to understand exactly what we were and where we stood in the white supremacist construct that is America. You know, I read history about world events, not just what happened to us.
Right.
And so that gave me a geopolitical grasp of empire, of the United States as a nation state. It helped me fully appreciate the role that the colonization played in the formation of the world that I was growing up in, the post-World War II era. A lot of the institutions that you see now today, whether it was the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF, the International Criminal Court, and all of these institutions were created when I was growing up. They didn't always exist. And so when I came out of prison in 1967, you know, I guess many of you seen or saw what was happening in the mid-60s. You know, it was a very tumultuous era.
Yeah.
The anti-war movement, it was building up steam. The United States was sending more troops to Vietnam. Every summer, the hoods, the neighborhoods were going up in flames. and the civil rights movement was building up steam in the South, and Malcolm was murdered. He was murdered a few years before I got out of prison, in fact. And so in prison, I became more of a nationalist than anything else. I had young brothers in the prison with me who were Pan-African, who were nationalists, who were Black nationalists. And that's how I got my name, Dhoruba. My name that they gave me was Anaye Zaliwani Dhoruba. This means he who was born in the storm. So Dhoruba means storm. And so that's why I like to say the young brothers like you, like many of you who are trying to pick up the mantle of our struggle and restore some type of integrity to the Black community, that our generation, I use the term whirlwind a lot, and it comes from a poem from Gwendolyn Brooks called The Second Sermon on the Warpland. And in that poem, and I'm paraphrasing, she says, "What will our season be which starts from fear? Live and medicate the whirlwind. It's in the whirlwind that you are real citizens, that you are citizens of the world. It's in the whirlwind." So I want to say to you, brother, it's good to talk to y'all, because if you look for me in this whirlwind, I'll be gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's a whole different ball game. The reason why I kind of jumped on the offer to talk to you is because one of the things that I've realized over the last few years, and I've done a couple of tours in Europe, speaking mainly to black people in Europe, in Germany, and in Austria, in France, in Italy, and I realized that that many of us, your generation, you're not really in touch with your radical history, your radical tradition. And so one of the things that we see happening is that you're reinventing failure. Many of the struggles that you are up against right now, we've already won those battles. And because we really don't have a connection, a continuity between the radical histories and the revolutionary movements that have preceded you, you're forced to go it alone in many ways under circumstances that are completely different than when I grew up. And I don't want you to take away from this for one moment that I think that that the Black Panther Party could be resurrected or reinvented in this particular day and time. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And it's the rhyming of history that you're dealing with. When the Black Panther Party, original party, was formulated in 1967, the white supremacist right in America was considered an extremist wing of the Republicans and the Democratic parties. They were eschewed and held at arm's length by the so-called GOP and Dixiecrats. But now they're mainstream. And one of the things that the Black Panther Party, the legacy of the Black Panther Party that you should really draw from, is the fact that in 1970, when the Black Panther Party called for a national front to combat fascism, 7,000 activists showed up at this conference, and we established national committee chapters, national anti-fascist committee chapters in cities around the country. But the reason why I bring that up is because the Black Panther Party was looked upon as a leading vanguard of the new left, white and black. It was only the narrow black nationalists, the ones that were talking about, black faces in high places, the ones that were walking around with dashikis on and bald heads, speaking Swahili, you understand, who never busted a grape. They wouldn't bust a grape with high heel shoes on. But they were posturing. They were what we would call cultural nationalists. And they were riding on the wave that was of history at that moment. You know, all across Africa, armed struggles were fighting against colonization. We had Frelimo in Mozambique. We had PAIGC in Guinea-Bissau, and MPLA in Angola, and the ANC in South Africa. We had the struggles in Algeria and in the East. We had Kwame Nkrumah. So there was a plethora of resistance within the third world, and especially within Africa, against white supremacy, against the international order of colonization and imperialism. And so the Black Panther Party came to fruition during this period, was born during this period. And so we related to the people of Palestine who were struggling against the white supremacist settler state of Israel. We were in solidarity with the PAIGC. We were in solidarity with the brothers and sisters in the Congo. We were in solidarity with the Cubans. We were in solidarity with all of those struggles of people who were fighting for their liberation and national self-determination. So the Black Panther Party came up at a time when the idea and the notion of a Black man and Black woman in the United States with guns and the right to defend themselves, you know, really touched a delicate nerve within the white supremacists and the white power structure. So the repression that was aimed at the Black Panther Party, whether you look at the COINTELPRO program, the repression that was aimed at the Black Panther Party was not aimed at us as individuals. It was not meant to just assassinate, you know, charismatic leaders. COINTELPRO's objective, and I think you should really try to hone in on this, what I'm about to say. The objective of the counterintelligence program was not so much to prevent the rise of an individual Black messiah that you've commonly read in one of the founding memorandums of COINTELPRO, but to prevent the ability and the capacity of African people to think as a sovereign people.
Mm.
Because if we thought as a sovereign people, then we would think in our own interests. Then we would have talked about a third political party. Then the idea of the Rainbow Coalition that came out of Chicago and that the Black Panther Party championed, the idea of that Rainbow Coalition would have been real to this day. And you wouldn't necessarily have to be in the formation that you were in order to manifest the politics that you're trying to manifest now, try to practice now. But that was co-opted. That was sabotage. And so that was the object of the counterintelligence program, to prevent Black people from thinking of themselves as a sovereign people, but instead think of themselves as a minority, as a national minority. Therefore, we had to achieve integration. We had to achieve put Black faces in high places in order to change policies, in order to reform the white supremacist construct that is America. And as I imagine each one of you know, reform of white supremacy and the reform of the United States white supremacist construct is not possible.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that is possible is its abolition. So the building of an abolitionist movement is a prerequisite, but a people that don't think of themselves as sovereign cannot talk about abolishing white supremacy. They're only going to talk about reforming it. We're always going to have the first Negro this, the first Black person that, the first this, the first that. But we don't have any political power. We don't have any sovereign political power. We can't control our communities. And we've learned from the struggles of the 60s that all politics is local. And that if we are able to control anything, it should be our own community. We should be able to control the police in our own community. We should be able to control the command structure, the command and discipline structure of the police. But we're not, because the police are armed agents of the state. and they're armed agents of a white supremacist state. And their purpose and their function in our community is to serve and protect, to serve those who are in power and that have money and that have wealth, and to protect their property. So having said that, I really would like to cut to the chase. And one of the things that I want to say here, and it might sound a bit, a bit, I don't want to say unreasonable, but one of the things that I really want to say to all of you who are listening is that we are living in a particular period of time when America and capitalism is in crisis. And this crisis is going to affect our people and is affecting our people. And if we do not understand that we have to prepare and train ourselves to prepare to defend not just the integrity of the Black community, but the idea and the notion that Black people do have a right to self-determination, and that our politics on the local and community and state level has to become part and parcel of our own expressions, of our own needs. It has to reflect our own needs. It has to reflect what we need as a people. And right now, as you can see, the consolidation of the right is almost complete.
Yes.
And the Black Panther Party in 1967 and 1968 and 1969 was the major force on the left that prevented the immediate consolidation of the modern police state that we know today. That was the Black Panther Party's major legacy. Without the Black Panther Party, we would have had a consolidated police state 25 years ago. But fascism, I call it democratic fascism, because it's delusion of democracy and electoral college system that gives people the perception or the misperception that they somehow control the state, that they somehow influence the policies and the state, when in fact, as Eisenhower pointed out when he came out of office, and I believe in 1959, and he warned the American people to beware of the military-industrial complex, the marriage of the military and corporations and the state. That marriage, that union has been completed, and you have the national security state that you have today. And our only defense against the national security state is to prepare our people to survive white supremacy and white violence in America, and understand that there's a class dimension for this. That's why we have a Black misleadership class. This Black misleadership class has evolved out of LBJ's War on Poverty. That's when it really began. They created all of these Negroes. That's when Black capitalism came up, when he said, well, these niggas is burning down the cities because they don't have no stake in it. They don't have no, they don't have any investments in it. Let's give them some investments. So he launched the War on Poverty. And right on the heels of the War on Poverty, of course, came the War on Crime. And the War on Crime was the pretext that led into the War on Drugs. The War on drugs was the camouflage for the militarization of the police. And I think that you need to study history and understand how fascism really evolved historically. And historically, fascism always necessitated not just the union of finance, capital, and the political system and the political elite, but it also necessitated a national police force. And America doesn't have a national police force. So when Nixon came into power, he had to try to fashion one when he declared the war on drugs and began to implement different types of congressional programs like the Omnibus Crime and Prevention, Crime and Enforcement Act of I believe it was 1969 or 68, which gave a lot of funds and military equipment to local police that began to train the local police in military tactics. The first SWAT team that came into existence in America was used against the Black Panther Party when it raided, when the LA office was raided in 1968. So from then you see what SWAT has become. You see how it's that the U.S. helps train repressive police forces around the world. In Africa, if you go to Ghana, where I live, you'll see that the equipment that the police are using at roadblocks is made in America. They look just like American. It just looks like American cops, you know, with their flak jackets and M4s and everything. So the major contribution of the Black Panther Party from 1967 to 1970 was to forestall the consolidation of the right of the militarized police state with the ideology of that jingoistic American white supremacist nationalism. Well, now we know that consolidation is complete. It's been completed. And so your job and your task now is far more difficult than anything that we face. You have a post-industrial revolution. I grew up during the industrial age. That industrial age is over. You're living in the age of technology, of instant communications, of weaponization of data and information. COINTELPRO is no longer necessary in its old form because now you have the weaponization of data and information, so that people now, organizing now is much more difficult than it used to be, because you no longer have a face-to-face relationship with each other and with the people. And in the old days, when the Black Panther Party was the leading cadre organization in America, we had a face-to-face relationship with our people. We had our own organ, we had our own voice, the Black Panther Party Community News Service. So no one had to ask what we thought or figure out what type of programs we were going to implement, because we knew what our people needed and we tried to step to it. But you know, the Black Panther Party is almost always portrayed now today as, you know, as basically social service workers. You know, we were just giving out, you know, free lunch programs, free breakfast, and free health clinics and all of this stuff, you know, which we did. But it was to teach Black people, it was to try to give Black folks an example of what community organization and community work and socialism really meant, how we could do for ourselves, how we could, but it was turned on its head. And so the party moved to the right. Huey and the West Coast Panthers, they moved to the right. And the counterintelligence program was very successful in that sense, in moving the leadership, the national leadership at that time, to the right before it could be democratized. Fred Hampton, who was murdered, many folks think that Fred Hampton was just murdered because he was charismatic, which he was, and that he was articulate, which he was, and he was a good organizer, which he was. But that wasn't the main reason that Fred was assassinated. Fred was assassinated just like the Panther 21 were arrested, and other leaders across the country at that time in 1969 and 70 were repressed, and the party office in LA was raided, was to prevent the Central Committee of the Black Panther Party from representing the activists from across the country. Fred was scheduled to become a member of the Central Committee. So was some of us in the Panther 21. And so to prevent this, the counterintelligence program made the moves that they did in terms of the leadership, dividing the leadership, sowing fear in the minds of brothers and sisters on one coast against the other. And this led to the West Coast moving to the right. So people think that the Panther Party split because of a beef between Eldridge and Huey, because of that, and that wasn't it. it was that the party had been pushed to the right, into the realm, and into the atmosphere and the environment of criminality. You know, many of the leaders on the West Coast, you know, they began to dabble in drug distribution. You know, they had their little nightclubs and they ran for political office. They moved to the right. Whereas those brothers and sisters who were in other parts of the country, including the East Coast, it wasn't just the East Coast, we maintained that the revolutionary character and the revolutionary strategy of armed resistance, of our right to self-defense. And I just wanted to say all of this to say that at this point, you know, I don't have much longer to be here amongst you to have these conversations, but I just want to try to depart to you the essence of this lesson, that there can be no justice in America for people of African ancestry without a democratic distribution of the pain.